Dear viewers, thank you for joining us. You're watching our weekly program, Talk to Obn on Obn Horn of Africa. In this edition, we'll be discussing about statement and press release issued by G7. And to discuss this matter, I am joining by a well-known political economy analyst of the Horn of Africa for a long time, Professor Lawrence Freeman. Professor, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, as I have mentioned, we are going to discuss about the recent statement issued by G7 on Ethiopian and Horn of Africa and the entire Africa affairs. To begin with, how do you see this statement?
The statement really says nothing new and nothing of substance. The State Department of the United States and the other G7 countries that issued this document are not addressing any of the real problems that are facing Africa, which is primarily poverty and economic development. And they just go through a list of comments about various parts of Africa, which are really very weak on substance. So I don't view it as any positive change in Western policy towards Africa, especially the Horn of Africa.
Well, again, Professor, the G7 have expressed its concern regarding the memorandum of understanding signed between Ethiopia and Somaliland on seaport access. How do you see how do you see the legitimacy and rationality of this concern? As we all know, the U.S., France, Japan, China, the UAE, and Turkey have naval bases on the coast of Red Sea. Why not Ethiopia, Professor?
Yes, the document says it's concerned about the memorandum of understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia that was signed, I believe, in January of this year, and that the fact that they do not support the development, the economic development of Ethiopia and its need for a port with access to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, Indian Ocean. This indicates the problem that the U.S. has. The U.S. should be supporting this type of expansion of Ethiopia's economy. And by them criticizing this memorandum of understanding, it shows that they do not understand nor care about the welfare of hundreds of millions of Africans living in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. If people in the region understood the question of physical economic development, it would be very easy, as it is obvious to me, why Ethiopia needs a long-term agreement for port access. And I think the United States could play a much more positive role. I don't think Eritrea or Somalia have any desire or interest in a conflict in the Horn of Africa.
Awesome. Okay. Again, this G7 described Somaliland as if it's, part of the Greater Somalia. Is there any scenario in which Somaliland is described as a region which is imparted in Somalia, as your knowledge concerns?
The question of Somaliland is actually fairly unique throughout the world because they became free from being a British protectorate approximately the same time period that Somalia became independent as a colony of Italy. And they were both independent, and then shortly after that, Somaliland joined what was called the Republic of Somalia. However, for the last 30 years, Somaliland has been acting as its own nation. I believe, it has its own government, its own foreign policy, its own security arrangements. And therefore, it's somewhat unique. Therefore, Ethiopia establishing economic relations with Somaliland would actually increase the wealth of the economy of Somalia. And that is what people do not understand. If you have a port which has modern infrastructure, railroad development, and the Ethiopian economy continues to expand its export and import trade, this benefits Somalia, as it will benefit all the nations in the region. Therefore, Somalia should say, okay, we accept this MOU because it's in the benefit of Somalia, Somaliland, and Ethiopia. This is obvious to me and should be obvious to most people. The argument that's made is that Somaliland is still part of Somalia. And that's a very technical issue because their arrangement was very short and very minimal. And therefore, there is a legitimate discussion to be had about the future of Somaliland.
Many political commentators criticized this press release and statement issued by the G7 on Ethiopia, Africa, and Horn of Africa. Among others, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and former American Foreign Service officer who served as American ambassador to Guinea and Ethiopia, Ambassador Tabor Naj, tilted that unfortunately it shows West's ignorance of Horn of Africa realities by criticizing Ethiopia-Somaliland port deal. So often West takes wrong side of history and ends up with strategic losses. This will be one. Do you agree with this notion? If so, how?
Yes, I think the ambassador Tabor Naj is largely correct. The United States, under its current president, Joe Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and for that matter, almost the entire Congress, Republican and Democrat, have very little, if any, in some cases, understand Africa, and even less understand the Horn of Africa. And therefore, the Ambassador Naj is correct. This is an agreement that is beneficial to raising the standard of living of millions, hundreds of millions of Africans in the Horn of Africa. It is, number two, it shows the potential for regional cooperation between African nations. Three, the port would also have a naval base, which would provide more security for the Red Sea when the Red Sea has become a very insecure place. Don't forget, Ethiopia is already exporting electricity to other African nations in the region from the GERD, which is almost complete. So regional cooperation is in fact already going on between Ethiopia and its neighbors. And this should be a model for the rest of the continent. Now, if we add port agreement between Somaliland and Ethiopia, and what that would involve in terms of an increase of trade and a reduction in the cost to Ethiopia of using, for example, the port of Djibouti, then we see more regional cooperation. Now, there are people out there who want to start a war, who want to instigate a war. Alex Dewal, an enemy of Ethiopia, and actually an enemy of Africa, talked about a conflagration between Ethiopia and Somalia. This is utter nonsense, but it's dangerous nonsense because there are people who want a war and they want to also overthrow the government of Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and they want to make sure there is no regional cooperation. They do not praise the GERD. They do not praise economic development. And therefore, this statement continues in that vein. And I'm very upset that there are people in the West who don't want to support development and regional cooperation and want to fan the flames of war. And that should stop now.
Appreciated, Professor. Okay, a former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel and Great Lakes region of Africa, Dr. J. Peter Pham said Ethiopia has played a critical role in providing peace and security throughout the region and has therefore every right to expect in return for that some goodwill and understanding for its legitimate interests and needs within terms of access to the sea and secure economic security for its people. It can't all be a one-way street. Do you share this view as well?
Yes, I know Dr. Pham, and he is correct in his statement. I concur with most of what he said. I would add that it is very clear, again, if people are not thinking from a standpoint of geopolitical mentality, do not have a geopolitical mentality, and you look at the facts on the ground, Ethiopia has 120 million people and continues to expand. Ethiopia has begun to expand its agricultural production. It has light manufacturing capabilities, which are also expanding. So it's the largest nation in the East Africa and the Horn of Africa. It is a growing nation, despite many, many internal problems. So therefore, if Ethiopia wants to expand its trade, outside of being limited to the port of Djibouti, where over $1.5 billion has to be paid each year to the port in hard currency, not local currency. If we have more port access, more trade will develop. We will bring in more revenue into the Horn of Africa. Somalia will benefit. Somaliland will benefit. Even Ethiopia will benefit. And this can be an example for continued regional cooperation. So those who refuse to recognize not only the legitimacy of having a port, but for me, as a physical economist, it is obvious and necessary. Now, many people complain about Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in making statements that are, quote, not diplomatic. I'm not going to comment on that. All I'm going to say, from my knowledge as an expert in physical economy, this port should be, Ethiopia needs a legitimate long-term access to the sea, and therefore should have a port, should have multiple ports in Eritrea, in Somaliland, and elsewhere. And this would be a normal understanding of people who understood physical economy and are thinking ahead to the future. As more and more people are born and live in the Horn of Africa, more and more economic growth must take place. And this is a way to increase economic growth. And people should get out of their mentalities of the past. We're no longer controlled by colonialism, by the British or the Italians. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of people in other parts of Africa and parts of the West that are trying to stop this economic development and trying to undermine this memorandum of understanding between Somaliland and the United States. So we have meddlers from the West and from Africa taking sides and trying to make a situation that should be easy to move forward with and trying to make it dangerous and complicated. And I think they should cut it out.
Well, Professor, several US diplomats and UK member of parliament used to clearly push for Somaliland formal recognition as a sovereign state, and where the federal government of Somalia has no control over it over the last 3 decades. Why has the seaport deal Ethiopia has made with it has concerned as a G7 and Somalia?
Well, that's a very good question. Why is the G7 and the United States meddling in to this question? This question of the sovereignty of Somalia and Somaliland, this is a legitimate question. This is a legitimate issue, and it should be discussed among African nations, and of course, including the African Union, IGAD, and other groups among Africans, and it should be solved in calm, thoughtful discussion. The fact that the E7 has taken a position on this, which includes my country, the United States, shows you part of the problem. Also, Turkey's become involved, Egypt's become involved, and others. And this complicates and makes the situation worse. If the United States and the G7 want to help the Horn of Africa and want to help Ethiopia and want to help Somalia and Somaliland, then they would be providing long-term, low-interest credits for infrastructure to build up the economy. They would be providing credits for inputs into agriculture, most importantly, irrigation and fertilizer. And they would be supporting and working and helping an arrangement for Ethiopia to have a port to expand its trade. And the very fact that they, A, won't help and support, and B, will criticize, shows you the problem. If they don't have anything positive to add to the development of the Horn of Africa, then they should keep their mouths shut.
Members of the G7 have expressed their concern about the growing threats to the maritime security in the Horn of Africa. They have mentioned the Houthi militia of Yemen and other pirates of the sea along the coast of this Red Sea. Why they fail to understand the quest of Ethiopia to fight against this traits in this part of the world?
Yes, but to answer that question, you have to look at a larger issue. We have to zoom out for a moment from Ethiopia and Somaliland. This is a long-term geopolitical problem. The Western, what's called, wrongly called, for me it's amusing, the rules-based international order wants to control the trade routes around the Horn of Africa. And therefore, they don't want independent nations or other nations outside the control of the rules-based order to be determining the policy in that area. And the increase in the activity of the Houthis, it directly follows the war that's going on between Israel and Palestine, where the United States is just pumped in another $26 billion into Israel. Palestinians are being murdered and killed and starved to death. The Israelis are rounding up Palestinians in the West Bank in a completely thuggish, lawless manner. And this has agitated, as expected, other countries in the region. So one of the problems is the Israeli attack on Gaza has increased activity of insecurity in the Red Sea. The larger portion then is, how do we provide economic stability and peace in the area? For me, I see the potential that Eritrea, which has a significant coastline, working with Ethiopia, we should actually repair that relationship and rebuild that relationship so that we have Eritrea and Ethiopia taking responsibility and leadership in organizing the entire region, along with Somalia and Somaliland. And if we can get this kind of regional economic cooperation and development, then we not only provide the potential for peace and prosperity in the region, but as you mentioned, we increase the security along the Red Sea, which, as I said earlier, part of the problem lies outside of the nations of Africa. It's a geopolitical problem. And I think the West does not want to see, in particular, the rules-based order oligarchy, does not want to see independent African nations on their own making decisions to govern the policy of the Horn of Africa. It is their coastline. It does not belong to the rules-based order. It belongs to those African nations, and they should be making decisions that are in the best of their interest and stop trying to instigate a confrontation.
Professor, again, many senior political economic analysts, including yourself, have appreciated the work is being undergone in the areas of increasing productivity in Ethiopia. You've lately appreciated the wheat cluster farming, the new trend of like increasing export, which was not a trend in previous years, but the G7 showed their critical concern about the severe economic crisis and widening food insecurity in Ethiopia. Is that a paradox, or who is correct? People like you or the G7?
Well, I'm an expert in the area of physical economy, and I've also have a unique understanding of Africa, which sometimes even the leaders of African nations, such as Ethiopia, don't understand my thinking on these questions. For me, it is obvious. The fundamental obligation of a nation, in this case, African nations, is to provide for the welfare and security of its people living today and into the future. That is, their children and grandchildren. That's the fundamental responsibility. Every human being is a precious individual because of the power of creativity of their mind and their soul. So therefore, a government, if it's functioning, is obligated to develop those individuals biologically, materially, and their mind, souls as well. Therefore, raising the standard of living of your population is primary. How do you bring the people into a level of stability and economic wealth where people don't have to scratch and search to survive each day? How much poverty is there in Africa? It's over 500 million people. Why is that? Because we haven't made the inputs in infrastructure. 600 million people do not have access to electricity. We have not made the inputs into agriculture. We have not made the investments into infrastructure. The G7 says nothing really about that. Now, you look at Ethiopia, which I know studied over the last now 10 years. They're making small amounts of progress. They're increasing their agricultural output. The agricultural ministry is moving forward. They're increasing certain other areas of their manufacturing capability. They have massive internal problems, which I've identified. Ethnic nationalism is the biggest security threat that Ethiopia has. And a lot of people have stopped supporting me because they don't agree with my position on these questions, and they want to criticize the government.
Wow.
There's probably many criticisms that can be made, but the fact of the matter is, if we're improving the standard of living of people, if we're improving agricultural and manufacturing output, if people can be living better today and in the future, that is something that we should be advocating and supporting. And the West has no understanding. The concept of economic development has been outlawed by the American lexicon. It's no longer discussed because they're not concerned about it. And the G7 paper is a laundry list of do's and don'ts to tell the rest of the world, but has no overriding principle to it in terms of helping develop the nations of the world.
One final question before you leave. While discussing the climate fund issue, the G7 statement describes it as optional and reads this way: this is part of our wider commitment to assist those developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change. So while they are taking the issue of climate fund as something optional and it's done to assist those developing countries, what really shows that this group is truly concerned about this global challenge and why they failed to appreciate the commitment of Ethiopian government in tackling climate change and global warming through green legacy initiatives.
The question of climate change is very much misunderstood. Our planet, which is a little bit over 4 billion years old from what we can tell, is been undergoing climate change from day one. There's constant climate change. We've gone through colder periods, we've gone through hotter periods. The same rules-based international order is using the issue of climate change to actually suppress economic development. One of the things they insist on is that African countries cannot use coal, should not use oil, should not use gas, because allegedly these are causing a change in the climate, which I don't believe they are. The changes in the climate come from our relationship to the sun and the solar system, not from human beings using energy. But there's an effort, a very harsh effort, to prevent African countries from using their own natural energy resources to develop their economy. Energy, the lack of electricity, is the biggest single killer in Africa, because without electricity, you don't have adequate food production. You don't have medical production. You don't have lights for people's schools and homes and libraries. The lack of electricity is killing Africans, and therefore to use the so-called climate crisis against the people of Africa to use their energy resources gives you another idea of how the rules-based order is looking at Africa. South Africa has one of the largest coal deposits in the world. They also have an incredible shortage of electricity. It's stupid and wrong for the West to use their colonial mentality to tell South Africa they can't use their coal. Now, the irony is even starker if you look at the question of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has now near completion of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which will inject 5,150 megawatts of power into sub-Saharan Africa, the largest infusion of power we've seen. Now, why? And that is considered, quote, clean, green, renewable energy. That's the way they describe it.
Okay.
But yet, the West has refused to support and praise and help in any way in the development of the GERD. Why? If there's such a great energy source, why has not the West at least significantly praised Ethiopia in that regard?
Wow. Honorable Lawrence Freeman, thank you for your invaluable insight on the latest press release issued by G7 against Ethiopia and Horn of Africa and entire Africa somehow. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you indeed. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. This brings you to the end of our today's edition. Bye-bye. Take care. Have a good one.